It's time to tear the plaster off. Shawn, myself, and yourself, we talked on our Monday recap show. We were in the FFPC Main Event Championship, facing against some of our listeners. Unfortunately for us, we didn't get over the line. We were almost there. We were at the line, but DeAndre Hopkins decided that he was going to trip us up as we approached the final stanza. So we did not win that particular matchup. Congratulations to the competitors that did get over the line and beat us. We're looking forward now to the sprint and the quest for the big prizes over there at the FFPC. We'll also be looking forward to some potential prizes over there at Underdog as well, Shawn, as we advance some teams into a couple of different contests over there at Underdog Fantasy. So looking forward to the best ball chase as well as the main event chase over the next couple of weeks. But
when you say pull the plaster off, I feel like maybe we're getting some different, as we had on the show a couple of weeks ago, some slightly different vernacular here. I'm imagining you horror movie style with your huge mallet, like knocking down the walls of your house. But are you referring to a Band-Aid?
A Band-Aid.
Were you applying Band-Aids after the game last night?
The exact same thing, Shawn, but we use different terms. So that was a good catch at the start of the show because, so the listeners know, there was a few times today where I did feel like punching my hand through the plastered walls in our house. But ripping a Band-Aid off, Shawn, to get to the American saying rather than what we would say over here. But there was time, Shawn, where we wanted to knock down the house, and we will talk through that game. We'll talk through the Packers game, both of those games affecting the outcome of the main event. But it's a very exciting time of the year to continue. We want to bring that excitement to the listeners. And I joked with Shawn before the show, over the last month or so, we've done a couple of these where maybe I've been like, oh, that result did not go good this week. And Shawn's picked me up and it's felt great on the Monday. There's other weeks where it's been the roles reversed. This week I was asking Shawn, what are we going to do when we're both so disappointed in the main event loss? But Shawn picked me up with some talk through our best ball teams here before we kick things off. So excited for this. Shawn, it did not go our way, but how are you feeling at the end of week 14? How did you feel about a double header on Monday Night Football? We're getting some different things over the next couple of weeks, including 3 games coming up here on Saturday. So the change in the schedule makes it a little bit more interesting as well.
You love having football all around you. So that part is always fun. I enjoyed these 2 games. Colm, my new favorite player, Tommy DeVito, he did everything that we needed. Almost put a shutout on your Green Bay Packers defense, which of course is what we are rooting for. If not for a muffed punt and a Saquon Barkley fumble against air, the Green Bay Packers defense would have put up 0. DeVito was magnificent in this game. Now, he doesn't put up huge raw numbers. He does rush quite a bit. But when he needed to throw, he threw extremely effectively. We've got 2 favorite guys, really, on the New York Giants. Wan'Dale Robinson and Jaylen Hyatt, both of these guys have had huge games in the last month. And I think that if you can get the offensive situation figured out with the Giants, I don't think that this game is the kind of game where you're like, we found our quarterback, but certainly you are very excited now about DeVito as a potential long-term backup, having these guys who can get you the victories. And this is a huge win over a Green Bay Packers team that came in hot and has a lot of guys playing well. He looked good. He looked competitive. Just everything that you want to see. It was a magnificent Monday night performance. The flip side of that is that Vic Fangio is my new least favorite NFL coach. This was one of the most embarrassing performances I think we've ever seen. And just a complete and total epic meltdown in every phase by the Miami Dolphins. This looks like a team that hasn't practiced in months, right? You have a field goal blocked. You have them basically only scoring when Will Levis and company give them the ball right at the goal line. And then you can't hold a 2-touchdown lead late. And you're playing against a quarterback who ends up with great stats. And you love to say, we talked on the show recently about Will Levis's competitiveness and athleticism is off the charts. He also has no idea what he's doing out there playing quarterback on an NFL team. And so for you to leave DeAndre Hopkins open by 30 yards when is the only player on this team that you have to account for, and you do it repeatedly. I mean, I have no idea what the Dolphins are doing down the stretch of this game. It was absolutely mind-boggling. Tua showed no awareness of the rush, no arm strength. He has Achane open down the sidelines for a long score and manages to overthrow that one. The team, when Tyreek Hill goes out, shows no life and like no offensive sense whatsoever. I mean, we're rooting really hard for Jaylen Waddle. We have him on a lot of teams. I wrote what I think is at least a vaguely interesting piece in the Monday article talking about how a lot of his peripherals in 2023 are actually better. And the numbers for Waddle are really, really encouraging. You should still be excited about him long term. And yet, especially then, we know defenses have, gone out of their way, and rightfully so, and relatively ineffectively, to try and take away Tyreek Hill and Jaylen Waddle in these games. Once Hill goes out, then there's nothing, because the defense can then take away Waddle, and they have nothing else to go to. We're not exactly rooting for Hill, although I did have a team or two that missed when it looked like it was going to make it because he doesn't play a lot in this game. But you have to love his toughness. And again, it's a question of, how badly injured was he really? But to see him come back in and make those plays and put a little spark into the offense. Tyreek Hill is basically the only player who shows up for this game for the Dolphins and more or less doesn't even play in it. It was a wild Monday night, and Colm, we were so close. I thought it was done.
Were so
I thought
close
it was over. And with about 2 minutes to go, it looked over. You can't give up 12 points to DeAndre Hopkins in the final 2 minutes of the game.
So right? I am you finish these games and you're like, well, it's over. I'm really disappointed. We didn't win. Let's just move on. And then I'm like 2 minutes later, I'm like, no, I'm digging into this. So Shawn, I dug into the play-by-play just to see how it fell apart. You mentioned the fumble in that particular situation from Saquon Barkley, where he kind of gets tripped but continues his run and then goes down and the ball comes loose and the Packers return it at that point. So that would have been 2 points at that point for the Packers defense. That was at 4:01 of the fourth quarter remaining. So that's 2 points that we lose at that particular point. But from 4:34 of the fourth, that is when the Titans get the ball back from the Dolphins after they get that second touchdown. This is how it reads. We get a drive that leads to the Hopkins touchdown. So it's 8.9 points on that drive. Then we get the follow-up drive because it goes 3 and out and a punt for the Dolphins. And that leads to a 36-yard completion straight off the bat. So over the course of those last 4 minutes, you mentioned 2 minutes, but I'm going to extend it to 4. That was a 15.5 point swing in a contest that we lost. I forgot the losing margin. I believe it was 6 points. So fell apart at the very end.
So you always hate to lose, Colm. One of the things that I've got a little bit of Monday night football, just gun shy, what have you here, because over the last 3 weeks on Monday Night Football, I'm 0-for-8 on toss-up games. So it's 0-for-4 in week 12 as we're trying to get the teams in, 0-for-1 last week as Ben and I are trying to get into an additional final, and then 0-for-3 last night. And I say 0-for-8, it was on toss-ups. It was actually 0-for-6 on toss-ups and then 0-for-2 in situations where we're fairly heavily favored going into Monday night. So a little bit of a disappointment there. It's taken what would have been a sensational main event season and moved it into the merely good category. But Colm, if your season, when you have a bunch of Monday night losses down the stretch, still falls into the good category, you have nothing to be complaining about. And I also want to say that, for us to win, somebody else has to lose. You already congratulated them. But I couldn't be more excited for the OT listeners that win this main event. Instead of us, congratulations to them. Congratulations to everyone else who won titles last night. And also, we're shedding tears and offering up consolation to everybody who is in the same boat that we are. But as you mentioned, we have 3 more weeks of excitement now. And Colm, one of the things that did happen is we got 2 additional Best Ball Mania teams in last night, and one of them would not have gotten in without the not really epic performance, but very big performance, especially within the context of this game from Wan'Dale Robinson. We've been waiting. And I mean, this is the guy that we thought we were going to get for the last 2 years. He was stunning in the game last night. You see the big speed, you see the ability to do basically Deebo Samuel types of things. He's not as big. He's not going to break as many tackles. And yet the ability with the ball in his hands, that hybrid profile there, where he can take these runs and break off big plays and then simultaneously do the same thing in the receiving game and get open deep a little bit. One of the frustrations that we've had with his usage, certainly you could include some guys like JSN. One of the things you've gotten to see a couple of times recently is that the Seahawks have realized, oh, wait, I mean, we drafted this guy in the first round because he was one of the greatest college football receivers of all time. Maybe we should use him across the line of scrimmage. They almost get the big touchdown 2 weeks ago. He has a chance for a long touchdown last week. Ball slightly underthrown by Drew Lock. Lock has been more willing to target him. He does lead the Seahawks in targets again, even though the actual numbers, which is what you care about for fantasy, go in the direction of the other 2 guys in that loss. But Colm, we now have a big game here from Wan'Dale Robinson. I believe it was a couple weeks ago that Jalin Hyatt went for over 100, and you got to see his vertical ability. I mean, 5, 10, 15 years ago, you'd want to have a big alpha target hog to go with these guys. You could argue that the Giants had tried to set it up that way with a Darren Waller who can do some of those things out of the tight end position. Perhaps some of that will come to fruition in the future. But I mean, Wan'Dale and Jalin together, especially when you consider that the draft capital spent on these guys wasn't extreme. I mean, a lot of people thought that Wan'Dale was overdrafted, but in the middle of the second round there, you could certainly see that paying dividends. I think he would be having a huge season if A, he hadn't gotten the significant injury midseason last year during his rookie year, and then B, if they had a functional offense. Obviously that's killing everybody on this squad. But I mean, the Giants are on a run now. And one of the things that's kind of fun about Monday Night Football too, I'm writing in my article during the day yesterday that for the Dolphins, this is going to be similar to a lot of their games where it's a race to score before you pull your players in the second half. And at the same time, you're kind of thinking to yourself, that's not really true. It's an NFL football game. Anything could happen. And as soon as you start to assume that things are going to follow the script, then you get a game like this. The Giants and the Titans were not out there to roll over for anybody, and they put a big dent into the playoff outlooks for the Dolphins and the Packers. It's really hard to overstate how devastating these losses are from a reality football perspective for these 2 franchises.
Yeah, I have to say more so for the Dolphins than for the Packers. You know, this is really a rebuilding year for the Packers. I think where they got over the last couple of weeks, has been further than fans of the Packers would have expected them to get. And it kind of felt for me leading into this one, although I did think that the Packers would win, it felt like this was the first game in quite some time where the expectation was you're meant to win this game. And you're on the road, and there's lots of things that can go wrong with a young team. We did see that during the course of this game because there was a lot of things went wrong. You mentioned some of the situations at Barkley fumble, but we had a muff punt from the Packers. We have a muff punt from the Giants. In a very close period of time, there was a lot of weird special teams plays in this game. And Tommy DeVito as well, credit where credit is due, also has a really nice rush where he is marked down at the 1 yard line, but he rushed for 71 yards in this on 10 attempts. 158 passing yards, 1 passing touchdown. But when you look at the actual performance, I think a lot of that, a little bit of a vanilla defense from the Packers there, and particularly in that last drive where the Packers do manage to take the lead after the Barkley fumble late on in the game, leave a little bit too much time on the clock, sit back in a prevent defense and let them go, 3/4 the length of the field to set it up for a field goal. So those numbers will be a little bit less without that, but credit where credit is due. The W came with it. Wan'Dale Robinson, who you mentioned, 6 for 79 on 7 targets. Nothing else really happening across the rest of the Giants passing offense. Saquon Barkley, 20 carries, 86 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Long of 34. Maybe lacking a little bit of the explosion that we have seen, but did still have a couple of nice runs in this game. On the Packers side, Shawn, Jordan Love did struggle throughout this, did 25 of 39, 218, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Also has a fumble in this one, which is lost. A really nice drive late in the game that led to the touchdown that he did throw, and quite a spectacular catch there on that one by Malik Heath. But in terms of the Packers and the rest of the performance, I have to say Tucker Kraft maybe stood out. We've talked about Luke Musgrave a couple of times. 4 targets for Kraft, and there's 4 receptions for 64 yards. Wasn't the most exciting offensive display by either team, Shawn, in this one. Any other notes that you want to mention before we move on to the Titans game, which I think has a little bit more to dig into with the expectations on the Dolphins and how that fell apart?
Yeah, the young receiving core for Green Bay doesn't exactly show up in this one, and yet you still have some of those fantastic plays, including the touchdown at the end. I think with the 2 tight ends, the Packers probably have a lot of ways to beat teams going forward. You could even argue that Kraft has perhaps been a little bit more impressive than Musgrave, maybe somebody who can draw more targets, while Musgrave is the more explosive player. That's kind of yet to be seen, but I think you have to be so excited about this. We did get the 4 carries from Jaylen Reed, and they were important because he goes for 38 yards on the score. We had done, again, on the show last week where we were working through the tools and how you decide on these start-sit decisions. We had gone through Cooks versus Reed. You look at Reed from a receiving perspective, and it doesn't jump out in terms of the 27 yards, although if you're in PPR, those 8 catches really go a long way. Obviously, Reed ended up with a much bigger game from a fantasy perspective than Cooks. So we got that one wrong. Cooks does get tackled at the 1-yard line in that Cowboys game. And I mean, frankly, Colm, the Eagles did not do their part of that shootout, which again, all of those scenarios work into that. But we hope that the listener was still able to get over the line or perhaps played Jaylen Reed anyway. Disappointing performance, as you mentioned, for Jordan Love when he had been looking so good coming out. I'm still very enthusiastic for him. I do think that you would like to see more aggressiveness from the favorites in some of these games. In addition to just playing poorly, you also got the strong sense that in many cases, the Packers and the Dolphins were playing not to lose, and it really robbed their team of the energy and the potential to attack within the individual play calls and the individual offensive and defensive schemes that would have allowed the likely gap in talent between the two squads, top to bottom, to come through. I think you have to put these losses on the coaching staffs of both teams.
Yeah, I agree there. Moving back to the Titans and the Dolphins, you mentioned Tua and the arm strength and things like that, but he just seemed a little bit out of sorts in this. A couple of the sacks he took, he takes, he slips on one of the plays down near the goal line. They have the turnover down at the goal line. The Dolphins should have won this game comfortably, and even with those errors, they almost won it comfortably. And then they got into a situation a bit like I mentioned with the Packers on that last drive where the Packers take the lead with a minute and change to go. They leave a little bit too much time on the clock, but they get in the end zone. But in this one, the Dolphins at that particular point are in the lead. They're in command. They get that second touchdown. There's a couple of turnovers for the Titans. The Dolphins then kind of sit back, prevent defense, and start to give up the yardage underneath. And both occasions, 2 touchdown drives in the last 4 minutes led by the Titans, and also a 2-point conversion in there. So
139 yards on the last 13 plays. And as you mentioned, the 2-point conversion, that was one where I'm always talking about the offensive pass interference. We benefited from T. Higgins getting called again. I mean, T. Higgins is going to have to deal with the fact that officials are not going to let him basically touch the defensive guys. It's just a weird situation every week where you watch these games and the defense can do whatever they want if the offensive guy. I mean, one of the situations that you get from time to time too is you get that chuck within the 5 yards, right? But only the defense can do it. If the offense does it, then and you separate it all, it's offensive pass interference, right? There's nothing you can do. And so for Higgins to lose a touchdown in that situation where it's just bad defense and he's using his size and physicality, that gets wiped off the board. You talk about the closeness of this game. And one of the things that you do over and over in your mind when you lose in a big moment and you really wanted to win is you play what if, and you tell yourself, That's not the way life works, and it's counterproductive. Don't get in that sort of mental spiral. But it's just human nature, right? You can't help it. There are what ifs on the other side as well, though, where, I mean, if T. Higgins scores against us, we're not even going into Monday Night Football. I think we've really got much of a chance. And I do think that touchdown should count. The 2-point conversion had some pretty flagrant cheating by the Titans. But again, you got to make the opposing team call it. I really felt like with how poorly Will Levis was playing and the ineffectiveness of this offense as they tried to incorporate Spears, their inability to develop Treylon Burks, which, you got to mostly put on Burks, right? The players have to come out and play. That Mike Vrabel was probably done in Tennessee and might not be a good fit for some of the things that teams need in 2023. Then he pulls out this 2-point conversion, which, Colm, you should do this every single time, right? You score in that situation, it's an automatic go for 2, but almost nobody does it.
And
it's
one
automatic.
Thing,
it completely changed the game. As soon as they made that 2-point conversion, you're like, the Dolphins are going to choke this.
The one thing on that as well, from the other side,
it. And now I'm like, Mike Vrabel forever.
From the other side, and this was something I didn't want to happen, when the Dolphins got that 2-touchdown lead, I was thinking, oh, they're going to go for 2 here. They're not going to kick the extra point, because I wanted all the points because we had the kicker, but they kicked the extra point there, which they were in a situation where they would have been a touchdown and the 6 points up, so 13 points up, but they could have went to the 15-point lead, which would have meant then that the Titans had to get the 2-point conversion, and they didn't do it. And then they ended up in the hindsight losing by 1 point because of what the Titans went ahead and done. But I am sure the Dolphins are, kind of gobsmacked by what happened in this particular scenario. I think they really got caught off guard. The other thing that the Dolphins did was when they go 3 and out after that touchdown from the Titans, they are in a situation where the 3 and out is caused by, we talk so much about how creative the Dolphins are, how they try and get their players in the best position to succeed. They just, ran 2 plays up the middle in that scenario and decided they were going to pump the ball. The creativity went out the window, and they really did get punished in the end up. But to look at some of the box score notes, Shawn, Raheem Mostert had another really nice day, 21 carries, 96 yards, 2 touchdowns, Achane 7 for 47 on the ground. Jaylen Waddle got a pretty big hit early in this game, but does go 8 for 8 targets, 6 receptions, 79 yards. Hill was out for quite a bit of time. It's a really nice catch when he does come back in for 25 yards, but he goes 4 for 61. Achane, 9 targets in the passing game. You mentioned a big opportunity that they missed down the right sideline. 5 for 24 from those targets. Hopkins, though, and Spears on the other side, along with Chigakonkwo, were kind of the main parts of that side of the game, along with Derrick Henry being able to punch in those 2 touchdowns. He went 17 for 34, so not doing a lot on the ground, but does get in the end zone twice. Spears, 7 for 29. And then Hopkins, 12 targets, 7 receptions, 124, 1 touchdown. Spears, 8 targets, 6 receptions, 89. And Okonkwo, 6 for 5 receptions with 46. I have to say, Shawn, the highlight play of the entire thing for me from the Titans side of things might be the pass to Derrick Henry for 17 yards, which I don't know if I've ever seen that before, but that was a thing of beauty. Derrick Henry getting up high to make that reception. You mentioned the referee call, and Shawn, I think very well put in terms of sometimes it goes for you, sometimes it goes against you from a fantasy perspective. The T. Higgins one, in my opinion, is a touchdown, so that makes up for this one that happened in this game. But the 45-yard completion to DeAndre Hopkins in this at the end of the first half is very flagrantly offensive pass interference that is not given. But he did get 124 yards.
If you're going to let the defense play, let the offensive guy play.
We have to touch on it as well, Shawn. The prediction for DeAndre Hopkins on Monday Night Football did not work out.
Can't shy away.
I should have cut it out.
Have a fantasy football podcast, and you're going to taunt the fantasy football gods.
They heard us.
They're going to hear you. They're going to punish you sometimes. Can't shy away. I would say it again. No regrets.
No regrets. Any other thoughts on this game before we move on?
I wish it hadn't happened.
Perfect. Moving on to some of the games from Sunday. And Shawn, the Denver Broncos, the LA Chargers, as we're recording, it's popped up here on the old Twitter or the X. Justin Herbert had his procedure on his index finger. Unfortunately, they were going to see what would be the process after that. In Rappaport reporting that he is out for the season, and makes sense, I think, long term for them to make that decision to kind of help his health. Some of the best ball rosters, Shawn, that we have, nearly all of the best ball rosters, Shawn, we have Quentin Johnson featuring on them at some point or another. He hasn't had a great rapport so far with Justin Herbert. We've seen him come in this particular contest, gets 4 targets and 91 yards from Easton Stick, who will be the starting quarterback moving forward here for the team. There was talk before this game as well with Austin Eckler splitting work. In terms of the carries, he has 10, Isaiah Spiller has 6, Joshua Kelly has 3, but he does go for 51 yards and a touchdown. Also has 7 targets, 5 receptions, 49 in the passing game, where I think he's much better utilized. Keenan Allen, 12 targets with just 6 receptions, 68 yards. On the other side, and part of that contest as we continue, Shawn, this is the therapy we're working through here. In terms of Courtland Sutton was on the opposition roster. He has a 46-yard touchdown. Russell Wilson bombs it deep, and it feels like Courtland Sutton's getting one of these every couple of weeks, but he goes 3 for 62 and a touchdown on his side. Not a lot else happening in that passing game, but the one thing I definitely do want to highlight is Jerry Judy has a play that is called a touchdown in this game, doesn't get a second foot inbounds. I think it is one of the poorest wide receiver plays of the season. We get a lot of criticism, and this one seems to have gone under the radar, but in terms of effort plays and, making sure you're in bounds, the first foot comes down, I would say, 4 to 7 feet in bounds, and the second one under no pressure. There's no reason for that not to toe drag along. And look, if you ask me to do it, I would not be able to do it, but a caliber player, the likes of Jerry Judy, I think, has to make that particular play. And then Javonte Williams, he has 17 carries, 66 yards. The note for him is gets into the end zone rushing, which he hadn't been able to do this season. I believe, Shawn, it was his first rushing touchdown since early 2022. What are we looking at here with the Broncos and the Chargers? And am I being too harsh on Jerry Judy's non-touchdown?
I mean, we would definitely prefer to be positive, and we drafted a lot of Judy. We had hoped that he was going to play better. Then you get into the situation where it becomes clear that Sean Payton is going to get this team turned around, and you think of the design on the touchdown pass to Adam Troutman that kind of puts this game away. Sean Payton doing a fantastic job. Russell Wilson kind of managing the things that he can still do well. And that includes, kind of throwing that jump ball. We were hoping to get basically a 0 from Courtland Sutton. And obviously that 46-yard touchdown does.
An amazing play by Sutton, who is like incredibly interfered with on his left arm, catches the ball with one hand on his right-hand side as he goes to the ground. Like a fantastic play.
And it's also funny that for this game, the highlight that the NFL is promoting is a one-handed catch from Courtland Sutton standing on the sidelines on just like a throwaway. It's like, the game has been exciting when a guy who is not involved in the play catching a ball is the game's highlight. No, I mean, he's done a good job. One of the things I think is a little frustrating here, one of the things that we weren't expecting was for Sutton to be emphasized the way he was in this offense and really be the only guy who is relevant. This is a game where Mims manages to get 3 targets, but not play particularly well, just kind of dodging a fumble on one of his drops. And you're thinking that Judy is the rising guy. Sutton is the guy who's probably a little bit overrated in, fantasy circles, just the perception, what have you. That has not been the case at all. If anything, it becomes increasingly difficult to understand how Jerry Judy was a part of that team there at Alabama, where you have Devontae Smith, you have Jaylen Waddle, obviously you have the situation with the 4th receiver there as well. But Judy, really the standout guy in the early going of that quartet. And for him to go to the NFL, and granted, some of these environments have not been great, and I've been making excuses for him for years, where as a rookie, he generates a lot of air yards, but you have really poor quarterback play. You have all of these different injuries. You continue to have bad quarterback play. You have some of the worst coaching the NFL has ever seen. And then you get midway through this season where he's frankly not drawing a lot of targets. And you have a game here where he's given a chance to make plays. There's another one of these sort of Russell Wilson throw up passes earlier in this game where does the pass come out late? Does it come out as a punt? Does it come out too close to the sideline when Juedy is open for an easy 50-yard touchdown? Yes, all of those things are true. But all Juedy has to do is trot over and catch it like a punt, and he does not do it. that ball can't go off your hands. I mean, there were 3 plays in this game where any competent NFL receiver has to make the play. And I mean, I don't think anybody is playing Jerry Judy in their fantasy finals or their game to get into the tournament. Certainly, if you have Judy on best ball rosters, you'd love to see him make that play, right? One of the things, Colm, that you and I were joking about, and we'll go into this in a little more detail in a minute, but the best ball season has been very fruitful again. We're excited about that. The hilarious part of it is that we're looking at all of our advancing rosters, and almost all of them have Jahan Dotson. And so if, for example, you were to have this type of game from Jahan Dotson, which frankly is what we've seen, right? Dotson also making very little effort on balls that, yeah, maybe they're not perfectly thrown in all cases, but an NFL wide receiver who wants to look at themselves as, number 1, a starter, number 2, an above average player, or number 3, a star, you've got to make some of those plays. You make a great play. You're excited for yourself. You're excited for your teammates. You're excited for your quarterback and how it lifts him up. I just don't know what to make of this because the Los Angeles Chargers are so bad at this point, and because the Broncos win easily, you tend not to get as much focus on that. But if you're Russell Wilson, if you're Sean Payton, you're simply not drawing anything up for Jerry Judy going forward. I mean, he's going to be part of the offense. He's going to play this secondary, tertiary, what have you type of role. I mean, there's no guarantee he couldn't fall, further down the depth chart. But you're not going to be going out of your way to get him involved when he has a game like this that shows no effort, as you mentioned, and also very limited talent. The no talent, no effort guys, I mean, they end up getting out of the game plan.
The one thing that we do know is that he has incredible talent, but you need to put in the effort. The talent's not going to work itself.
Well, I mean, you can have change of direction skills that allow you to get open, but that isn't everything. I mean, Sky Moore can make a cut. He has never been in the place that Patrick Mahomes thought the ball was going to be thrown, and he doesn't make any catches. So you have some parallels here, even though Jerry Judy above Sky Moore probably, but again, you've got to bring the full package. Being able to do one thing well, especially in a situation where Russell Wilson is your quarterback, is not going to be nearly enough.
We're going to go to the Cincinnati-Indianapolis game in a moment, but a couple of notes just throughout the rest of the games from yesterday. Mike Evans obviously had a very down game for what people would have been hoping as he was moving through the season. I'm sure that'll bounce back pretty quickly, almost as a spectacular touchdown in this, where you mentioned Garrett Wilson's play yesterday, Shawn. Evans diving towards the side of the field, but his hand comes down before the second toe is dragged outside of bounds, and spectacular attempt, but unfortunately doesn't get in, and obviously changes the outlook of his fantasy day quite a bit. We get Drake London with one of the best games of his career. He gets 172 yards in this particular one, 11 targets, 10 receptions for him. Shawn, you mentioned those best ball streets being fruitful. Quite a lot of best ball rosters with Drake London. It was nice to see this performance. It's hard to know if that's going to happen again. Desmond Ridder with a pretty solid game here too. In the Jacksonville-Cleveland game, Evan Engram had a 32.5 PPR point game, obviously in tight end premium, boosting that up even further. We also had David Njoku with a masterful performance, 2 touchdowns coming the way from Joe Flacco, Shawn, at this point may be the greatest Browns quarterback of the last 20 years. There's a possibility that will be the situation. He has played 2 games for the Cleveland Browns. The other part with the Evan Engram performance was the Browns had not allowed a tight end performance above 8 PPR points, which was Mark Andrews in week 4. They'd also only allowed 3 tight end touchdowns all year, and Engram obviously got in the end zone twice in this one. The surprising note, I guess, heading into the weekend for that one was that Trevor Lawrence did play, but they do lose to the Cleveland Browns in that particular contest.
Situation here with Engram too, I think underlines an important sort of tactical decision or approach that you can have when there is a congested depth chart of receivers. And one of the points that we made when we're looking at the Jaguars coming into this year is that you don't really know how it's going to play out. It's possible that Calvin Ridley comes back and he's exactly what he was previously. It's possible that Christian Kirk can continue to build on what was a breakout season. I think a better season even than people realize in 2022. One of the reasons why you might have faded Ridley a little bit is that Kirk not being given quite enough credit for how good he was within the context of that offense. It's possible that Zay Jones, who had some stretches during the season where he was very, very good. The full season number is not as impressive, but some stretches of great play. And again, one of the notes with him, just more athletic than people realize, maybe more athletic than the rest of those guys. It's a pretty athletic group overall, but he could be somebody who would be a thorn in the side of the rest of the players. Now, he struggles with some injuries this season and doesn't end up doing much. But when you're looking at that group and you have Evan Engram, and he's not only priced at a much better level than Ridley and Kirk, but he addresses a position that, if you can hit on it, is going to do more things for you. You have fewer options there. Now, I think you could make a case that in 2023, it ended up being maybe easier to fill your tight end spot. At the very least, we were very fortunate this year that not only did we have a tight end or two hit, we had a lot of tight ends hit. And that has really carried us. And so from that perspective, the tight end wasn't maybe as difficult as finding enough wide receivers. But when you're going through a draft and you have multiple interesting receiver options in every round, and you know that the structure of a draft is going to make it difficult on you at tight end if you don't make certain choices, then, I mean, Engram was the pretty straightforward play. And he hasn't hit in a massive way, but his season, especially, once you include this game that's very important in week 12, as people are trying to get either into their playoffs, into tournaments, win FFPC leagues. This is a big performance that, again, I think underlines the advantage that you can take by understanding how scenarios are priced and how individual team depth charts lend themselves to some exploitable possibilities.
Shawn, the Saints kind of beat the doors off the Carolina Panthers, and again, what is not a great division down there in the NFC South, but 28-6. But my takeaway on that is in terms of how much the Panthers are struggling. We'll not get into it too much because we did beat them up a little bit about their the trades, and then after we finished talking on the show yesterday, we dived further into that. We were talking about trading Christian McCaffrey, the attempts to get a quarterback over the years, giving up capital to try and get those guys in the trade market. Lots of difficult times for the Panthers, but the Panthers have one passing touchdown in their last 5 games. Shawn, Bryce Young hasn't hit double digits in fantasy points since NFL Week 8. So it's a tough time at the moment for the Panthers, and Young is really struggling with some of these performances. The one bright spot, I guess, for them over the last couple of weeks, I would say, is Chuba Hubbard, who continues to do pretty well in terms of fantasy points scored. A game, Shawn, that we're just going to talk about for 30 seconds maybe is the Minnesota Vikings, Las Vegas Raiders.
The stat, I mean, you've almost undersold the stat line in this Panthers Saints game, where Derek Carr throws for 119 yards, averages 4.6 yards per attempt, has a pick. The leading receiver for the Saints, and again, this is kind of devastating if you have Chris Olave, although he is one of the guys who gets in the end zone. Derek Carr did throw 2 touchdowns, which is nice. But you had A.T. Perry lead them in receiving with 44 yards on a single target. Your guy who leads the team got 1 target in the game. Lynn Bowden Jr. has 4 catches, which is somewhat humorous. We like him. To win that game 28-6. 28-6, when those are your own team stats.
This game, Shawn, it was It was by design that I skipped over the entire game because this was bad.
Colm, I can get through these games in about 40 minutes, right? When I'm watching beginning to end using the different fast forwarding options through the YouTube TV and the NFL Sunday Ticket package. It's not a huge time investment. It tends to be a lot of fun. Sometimes I spend it on the treadmill. Watching this game would be 40 minutes of your life that you never get back. Right?
I don't know how you
are
can
on your
fit 40
deathbed and you're
minutes
thinking back, you're like, I just used my life very effectively, except for that 40 minutes I spent back in 2023 watching Panthers Saints.
On the way I watch it is through Game Pass and the Game in 40, and I feel like the Game in 40 in this one, I think they were having to. You know, games are bad when it's a Game in 40 where they start showing the broadcast replays of the plays. They're making sure that they're showing everything over and over again. This one was a stretch. But another game that was a stretch, Shawn, was Minnesota 3, Las Vegas 0. NFL teams.
Have you watched this one, Colin?
I have. And NFL teams, Shawn, since 2008 are now 1 and 255 when they score 3 or fewer points. That one is Minnesota with their performance this week. This game.
Did they show on the telecast that you watched that in the game context that the Dolphins had last night, teams had won, I think, something like 767 times in a row.
So they shouldn't have lost?
Well, I mean, you can always lose.
Yeah, always lose. The win probability there was definitely in the Dolphins' favor. Unfortunately, Justin Jefferson, who came back from his injury, does pick up an injury in this one. Seems like a chance that he may be back out there in week 15 here, for obviously the Vikings and for fantasy managers, but really tough to see him get hurt. We obviously want him to be healthy, but takes a big shot, a fair shot, in my opinion, on this one, but obviously misses the rest of the game. Then we have Josh Dobbs, who had a really bad game that we documented a couple of weeks ago. Then they had their bye. Then he gets a chance to start again. This game was not going well. And, they weren't getting the ball to any other weapons. They weren't getting it to Tyjae Hawkinson. They switch quarterback. The ball starts to get out a bit quicker. The plays are a bit more, I think, in rhythm. The one problem I think Dobbs was having was when he was getting pressure in his face, he was trying to move off the line a lot more, trying to scramble out of the pocket, and we didn't see that with the change. The other note in this, Shawn, is Jordan Addison, who was looking really strong at the start of the season. I think part of this is on the quarterback play rather than on Addison himself. Some of the big plays he had earlier in the season, Kirk Cousins, for all the things I'll criticize him about, he can get some really nice deep passes to his wide receivers. Addison, though, has not scored more than 11 PPR points a game since week 8. Lots going on there with the Vikings side of things. A lot to keep an eye on over the next couple of weeks or the next couple of days ahead of a week 15 for some vital fantasy championship matches here in different formats.
So my question here, Colm, is that maybe my favorite team that I have left, it's in the format called the Chihuahua, but Superflex. It appears to have a $25,000 grand prize, which isn't $3 million, but you would love to have. This squad has Christian McCaffrey, Jonathan Taylor, and Justin Jefferson. Tell me Jonathan Taylor and Justin Jefferson are going to play again before this team is eliminated.
I don't think they are. I think Jefferson may. Haven't heard much on Taylor ahead of week 15, but we'll see.
You're like Sam Howell and Desmond Ridder are going to have to score a lot of super flex points for you this week to get that team across the line.
Yeah, the one thing I was doing, I love to do out an Excel spreadsheet and check how the teams are looking. But once they advanced on Monday, I went through it, or on Tuesday, sorry, checking for injured players. Shawn, we came second in the FFPC Best Ball contest a couple of years ago, and one of the things that happened to us at the very end was we were like, there's a lot of players here that are no longer available. And having healthy players at this particular point and having those players who can put up points is obviously massive. For a team like that, Shawn, there's no doubt. If you get those two guys in, that team's a contender. If those two guys aren't there, that team may not make it past week 15, unfortunately. So let's hope they get out there for you.
Colm, this seems like a good point to mention the fact that you did extremely well again with our drafts. And I did mention this recently. I know for some listeners it'll be too much to mention again, but the drafts with you have been so much fun. And I did go back and actually work through all of the different formats in Underdog that we participated in, count them up. We did 9 drafts for shows. Of those 9 teams, 5 of them did advance. And I mean, obviously, again, in a smaller sample, you can do that, but 5 out of 9, just absolutely fantastic. Some other drafts that we did on the air, we had the team with David Philippi that won first place. We have an FFPC Superflex team that made it across. And so that's a lot of fun. I mean, obviously, your chances of winning are obviously very small. There are a lot of very good, very similar teams in the tournament, but it gives us a chance to, try and get back into that overall FFPC Best Ball Tournament Final, a chance to get back into that Superflex Final. It's exciting for me that I have a team with Eric Hove, who's done some work for RotoViz and did a fantastic job filling in on OT when I was traveling. A team with him in the Never Too Early tournament, so a shot to win there. Have a team with Blair that's in the Superflex version of it, and Blair and I have had some Superflex teams that have done pretty well. It's nice to get that. I have a team with Connor that's into the Best Ball tournament playoffs here, and I have mentioned before that if you can't beat him, join him. So I won't lose to Connor on that team. He is my partner. The FFPC advance rate for the different teams there was around 30%, which obviously is exciting. But I appreciate so much the teams and the drafts that I've gotten to do with you. And obviously, even though it's a bit fluky, I hope that having 5 of the 9 teams that we did for shows advance, that maybe that has had a positive carryover effect for listeners being able to get some of their teams across too. Obviously, like we do every year, made a lot of mistakes. We very openly have joked about having Dotson on all those teams. I mean, the thing about it is that if he could somehow go off now, you have a player that other people don't have. You think it's going to work out? You like Dotson? You think that the Commanders are going to turn over a new leaf and go back to throwing to their wide receivers? It's been a dry spell for Terry McLaurin and Jahan Dotson. For Sam Howell to do what he needs to do for us over this final month, I mean, Eric Bieniemy is going to have to dial up some pass plays to the wide receivers.
Shawn, they've had the bye week. They've got it all fixed. Everything's sorted ahead of week 15 here. You need bodies. I mentioned it a minute ago. The players that make plays that change the course of the best ball finals and things like that over the next couple of weeks may not be the guys that we've expected all along. For example, if Wan'Dale had that performance last night in week 16, week 17, that could change the outcome of a lot of things. So having players in there who have the talent and who we've seen do it before, even though it's not on a consistent basis, they're the players you want to have in there. I have a couple of the FFPC teams that I was looking at today that have T. Higgins on them. It hasn't worked out for the majority of the season with Higgins, but he's a player who can have those explosive performances, and that's the game that we're going to go into next. But Shawn, I don't want to skip over it. I really appreciate you giving those kind words. There's no need to do that on air, I feel, but I do appreciate when you do mention it. But I also want to mention to the listeners, the draft with Dave will be coming out as a podcast on Thursday on the RotoViz Overtime podcast feed, where we made that draft. It won that league. It's advanced now into the FFPC $125 best ball contest, the one that we're hoping to take down this year. So
if you haven't listened to that one, Colm, that one is pretty funny.
Why,
obviously we don't do these funny? We don't do these drafts to mess with you, obviously, but when I'm there trying to click and it's like I've got our guest pushing for one selection, Colm pushing for a different selection, I'm like, I kind of have to go with the guest. But for anybody who hasn't listened to that one, Colm gets mad during this draft, which, I mean, some of the Colm, do you think that the picks were right in the end. I mean, you really wanted Tua, which for most of the season would have been great. It has worked out to go in a different direction. We are excited about this team, and it makes for great content having worked out.
I would highly recommend listening to this one. This was so it's funny, and I was kind of, I think, playing into it a bit as we went along. But there's a couple of picks we wait on tight end. There's quite a bit of heat on the avoiding tight end picks throughout. There's picks that I wanted that definitely wouldn't have worked out. I believe I really wanted the Kyle Pitts pick, and we passed on him for Justin Fields, which obviously heading into these playoffs, the field side is the side I would rather be on there. So check it out. It will come out on Thursday. Ourselves, Dave and Shawn. Dave as well, advancing in the Scott Fish Bowl. I seen a tweet today as well. So he's having a great fantasy season. We'll see how it finishes out, hopefully with us winning that particular contest. But it is interesting, Shawn, when you look through some of those teams and see how things play out. But I'm excited for the best ball stretch here to see how it all finishes up. What I would say is we may do a show heading into this week looking at some of the rosters, our favorite rosters. There's some, I think, pretty loaded ones there. But what I would say, if listeners want to share any rosters, you mentioned hopefully it has gone well for the OT community. I do get messages saying, that they have these teams that have advanced and things are loaded up for them as well. So it is exciting to hear that. But I'm also cognizant of not filling the RotoViz Overtime podcast feed with every single podcast that we did over at Underdog that is advanced and everything at the FFPC that is advanced. So what I would say, if you go in and you search for Underdog Fantasy, for example, in the podcast player, it will populate all those particular drafts. You won't know at this particular point in time which ones have advanced. I guess that's what posting them would help with. But you'll be able to hear us, and you're always able to hear the takes in hindsight of how things worked out or didn't work out, and see what we could improve on next year. But Shawn, the final game we're going to talk about on this particular edition is the Bengals and the Colts, like I promised, I think 15 minutes ago. But it was the Bengals 34, the Colts 14, both teams 7-6 in the season. Jake Browning having a nice game here, 275 passing yards, 18 of 24, 2 touchdowns, 1 interception. Does get a lot of help after the catch, but Chase Brown, I think, is the player that I would be interested in discussing more. We do get a positive game here from Joe Mixon, 21 for 79 and a touchdown on the ground. He also gets 4 targets, 3 receptions, and 46. But Chase Brown's 8 for 25 on the ground. Then we get 3 for 80 and a touchdown on 3 targets, a 54-yard reception that he pretty much does all of that after the catch. But Brown now, Shawn, played 30% of the snaps this week. He's had 32% and 28% of rushing back share over the last 2 games, and obviously used a little bit more as a receiver this week with a 12% target share. But he was somebody in that main event that we've talked so much about that obviously wasn't part of the plan to play this week. He was never in conversation. But we obviously had the injury to Ramondre Stevenson. We didn't want to be left short at running back with the next 3-week stretch to see what upside players we could potentially have. And Chase Brown was the player added to that roster as well. So a nice little piece to potentially have over the next 3 weeks if he was to be needed. Jamar Chase, a quiet day for him, 4 targets, 3 receptions, 29 yards. Michael Pittman continues to have some very productive games, 11 targets, 8 receptions, 95 yards for him. Josh Downs just kind of faded a little bit over the last period of time. And then Zach Moss has really struggled over the last couple of weeks since he's come back in for Jonathan Taylor. So you mentioned you want Jonathan Taylor back, Shawn. I think this Colts team wants him back as well. Minshew, 240 passing yards, 1 touchdown, 1 interception. Chase Brown, Shawn, is somebody I know you have liked. What is your thoughts on this performance, the speed that he showed on that particular play, and what can we expect over the next couple of weeks? Because sometimes in this situation, you're looking at the backup running back is really starting to put pressure on the starting running back. But over the last couple of weeks, Joe Mixon has been quite productive overall.
Brown is so much fun. It was really cool to see that play. He is on some of those rosters that advanced, and you're looking at that when you're in that battle for the 2-3 spot in the final week. And it can be a little bit difficult to parse when you just have so many different rosters. But, part of your brain is going to the, is that the play that actually allowed us to get into the tournament? I'm really excited that we have him on the main event. Hopefully we won't need to use him, although if there was some indication that in week 17, the Bengals were going to go almost exclusively that direction. I could certainly see playing him over Javonte Williams, who, I mean, Javonte had a game that worked for us this past week, and yet every week with that Broncos attack and with how plodding he has been coming off the injury, you do feel like it's touchdown or bust. And, it's mostly been bust. As you mentioned, that's the first rushing touchdown he's scored all season. Brown brings a level of athleticism that few backs can match. It is so reminiscent of what the Lions are trying to do with David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs, what the Dolphins are doing with Raheem Mostert and Devin Achane, what the Ravens are kind of doing. As we mentioned yesterday, it was a weird game for the Ravens where Lamar Jackson threw very erratically, somewhat successfully, and they did not run the ball. They still do win that game. But what the Ravens are kind of doing with Keaton Mitchell and Gus Edwards, it's taken a month or so for Keaton Mitchell to move into the situation where he's the lead back. That can always go back the other direction. One of the things that we saw last night was that Raheem Mostert is the guy who gets those high value touches, and in any given game that can just make such a huge difference. Joe Mixon obviously gets the rushing touchdown in this one. There's probably a difference in the perception between Mixon with the Bengals and Gus Edwards with the Ravens, although you could argue that in some ways Edwards has been better with the Ravens than Mixon has been with the Bengals. Mixon more or less losing, at the very least, the starting job, maybe not getting demoted to a backup, but falling into a pure committee with Samaje Perine in last year's reality playoffs. It's not impossible that Brown would force the committee here, or even get into that position where Keaton Mitchell appears to be right now with the Ravens. They have the 29 running back carries in this game. The offense, a lot more functional than you expected. A lot of the splits coming in here, a lot of the trends, I should say, coming in here, very positive for the Colts. If you had checked out Blair's Wrong Read article, a lot of the things working in their direction. This was a very surprising result to me, not so much because the Bengals win, but because they control this game. And they are at home. They do have a team that's been in back-to-back AFC Championship games. If your quarterback plays well, even if he's obviously not Joe Burrow, then you will perhaps put up some games like this at home. And yet, for the Bengals to be able to so completely control the Colts in every way, shape, or form, it's not just that that's an encouraging win for the Bengals, but it does create this dynamic where you could see the running back position be very valuable for the Bengals down the stretch. And if it's valuable overall and then Brown gets a decent chunk of that, then we're starting to talk about someone who's pretty interesting. And you look at the long touchdown here, and you're going to occasionally get some one-off plays like that from talents or running backs with that much long speed. The question is what else you can do. It doesn't jump out in the stat line, but even more impressive to me than the long touchdown, although the long touchdown obviously is what catches your eye. You're like, well, that, and then what else? The stats don't really show it, but he was very impressive on his other 10 touches in this game. And that part to me was very, very encouraging. He's the guy that Blair and I really loved during the prospect portion of it. You always have a little bit that voice in the back of your head saying, are Blair and I like getting each other too excited? Is there a little bit of an echo chamber building here? Is it too much of a long shot type of dart throw where he's a later round pick? He's an older player. He is not a bell cow size. Do you really want to put that much on him as a breakout type of candidate, and then you lose a big chunk of the season to injury? It's exciting to see what he's doing now. I'm not saying that he's going to be a breakout star, but I do like all of these small backs. I mean, Jaleel McLaughlin has been a little bit disappointing since his original emergence, but you need this electricity in the rushing game. I think it adds a very valuable piece to a Bengals team that everything that Joe Mixon has gotten over the last 3, 4, 5 years has been exactly what's blocked and nothing else, other than he does fight at the point of contact, right? He doesn't go down on the first guy wrapping him up. The problem is that gives you an additional half a yard here and there. Chase Brown is a guy who can give you an additional 50 yards. And when you get that long score, I mean, that long score was one of the things that changed this game and allowed them to still be in a good situation when they have the turnover that leads to the bang scores for the Colts. I mean, outside of that very limited sequence, everything was completely and totally controlled by Cincinnati in this game. You mentioned Michael Pittman. I do think it's interesting on Indianapolis side. He has 11 targets, catches 8, goes for the 95 yards. He has a 31-yard catch. Another very impressive game. And it's kind of that question with Pittman of how much does he benefit from the weakness of his teammates and how much would he actually be freed up if they had some other guys impressing. This was very much a game where the only thing that Gardner Minshew could do was throw to Michael Pittman. The disappearance of Josh Downs has been a big problem for them. The fact that Alec Pierce, who did have a big game a couple weeks ago, is just a shot guy and against the vast majority of teams isn't going to do anything for you. I mean, some of this goes on the fact that Gardner Minshew, though a very successful backup who's led this surprising season for the Colts, I mean, he's played well. He can do some things. He's still going to have that kind of backup / starter borderline type of profile where, you know, he's probably in that like 28 to 35 range in terms of where he would rank among all NFL quarterbacks. He's played well, and yet, I mean, he's going to need some other guys to show up here. He didn't get that in this game, and it wasn't. There's so many interacting elements of an NFL football game that assessing blame and giving credit always a tricky chore, but you didn't see the same type of creativity and dynamism from a play calling perspective and from an overall attack perspective in this one from the Colts coaching staff that has really been a signature of the season as they worked with Anthony Richardson originally and then with Gardner Minshew to get to this point. Pittman needs the rest of the guys to show up. Josh Downs, he'll be a really interesting player to watch over the last month. For a while, I think it was very legitimate to have him kind of rising into the range of some of those first rounders. I mean, you could make the argument that he would have been ahead of Quentin Johnston, who obviously has had a terrible year. And yet the contrast of what Downs did in this game with what Johnston was able to do, as you mentioned, when Easton Stick came in. I mean, suddenly you see the Quentin Johnston, you know, Superman cape. Every element that flashed in his profile is evident on a handful of plays late in that Chargers game. We want to remember that these are young players, even the first rounders, and the last month is going to be huge. I can't wait to see what unfolds over the next 3 or 4 weeks.
Yeah, likewise. So, Shawn, we've talked through our sadness, our pain. We've got to this point where we're excited for the next couple of weeks and the rookies continuing to impress with big plays. So that is going to do it for this edition of RotoViz OT. As I mentioned, the draft that we did with Dave will be up on the Thursday. Podcast on the feed is a bonus show this week. We'll still have our Friday edition. So make sure you are subscribed to the RotoViz Overtime podcast feed to get all the shows once they're available. You will never miss any. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at @OverToMarlin. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.